Hello and a very warm welcome to a brand new edition of World Panorama with me, Frank Pereira, on Rajya Sabha Television. Over the next half an hour, we'll bring you a roundup of all the significant events to have taken place around the world this week. But first, a look at the headlines. Russian Navy, Air Force and ground troops intensify attacks on Islamic State targets in Syria. US-backed Syrian rebels also in Russia's line of fire despite strong protest from Washington on Russia backing Assad's regime. Protest and withdrawal of humanitarian group Médecins Sans Frontières after US coalition troops bomb a hospital run by it in violence-racked Kunduz in Afghanistan. United Nations labels the attack as a war crime. Surprise Nobel Peace Laureate for 2015, Tunisian National Dialogue Quartet chosen among 273 nominees for its work in bringing democracy amid post-Arab Spring tensions in Tunisia. And FIFA top brass, including President Sepp Blatter and Secretary General Jerome Walker, suspended from football's world governing body. FIFA's ethics committee is investigating massive corruption allegations. Well, our top focus on World Panorama this week. Russia stepped up three-pronged attacks in Syria through its naval fleet, aerial strikes and ground offensive against Islamic State positions and US-backed rebel strongholds. While the Kremlin's stated aim in the conflict is to fight the Islamic State in Syria, the United States and its allies say Russia is concentrating its firepower on preventing President Assad from being overrun. Political motives have emerged for Russia asserting its might in the Syrian crisis. Here's a report.
Cruise missiles from Russia's naval fleet stationed in the Caspian Sea targeting Syrian rebels more than 1,000 miles away. More than 100 Russian airstrikes. The targets are Islamic State holdings and Syrian-backed rebels operating against President Pasha al-Assad. Washington and its allies caught on the back foot. And a major ground offensive by Russian troops 1 week into the country's intervention in the Syria conflict. Russian President Vladimir Putin encouraged the Free Syrian Army to join an alliance with the Syrian government against the Islamic State, insisting that inroads made by Russian troops were positive.
We are aware of how difficult such anti-terrorist operations are. It's too early to discuss the results, but the things that have been done so far deserve a high positive mark.
But the Russia-US divide deepens over support to Syrian President Assad. Moscow had stated its claim to be fighting the Islamic State in Syria, but the US and its allies say Russia is concentrating its firepower on protecting Assad's troops. Pitched battles have broken out. Via Palmyra and Aleppo, Syrian troops advanced to Idlib using top-end rocket launch systems similar to the one Moscow shipped to Syria last week. A Syrian rebel commander said government forces shelled his unit's positions in Hama and onto Man, south of the city. They've also struck against rebel groups at Kafran Buda, another Syrian regime stronghold. US and Russian officials tentatively agreed to resume talks on how to coordinate in the skies over Syria, though the US rejected the possibility of teaming up with the Russians. A rising distrust threatens to get murkier.
Their approach, which is to support Assad rather than a political transition, and meanwhile fight the opponents of Assad of all different kinds, is doomed to fail. Why is it doomed to fail? Because it will only inflame, I've used the phrase, pour gasoline on the civil war of Syria. Our approach is different. It is to pursue the defeat of ISIL and a political transition in Syria at the same time. Russia seems to believe that you can have one without the other, and that's simply not realistic.
We use data from space and air intelligence, not the information that we get from our Syrian partners. We check this data 100 times. and the decisions that are made based on them are carefully balanced. We perform airstrikes only when we know 100% that we are hitting the target. We do not just hit any civil or military objects.
There's also the Turkey dimension. The NATO member claims Russian aircraft violated its airspace on more than one occasion, risking the lives of thousands of civilians. Analysts say, meanwhile, that Syria is crucial for Russian President Vladimir Putin's strategy. They say it goes beyond support to old ally Assad to Russia's keenness to maintain an influence in the Middle East.
And the problem was to keep not only Syria under control of Russia, but to be present in the Middle East, in this space. And also it's very important because it was a pretext to show that Russia is able to have national interest, not only on the post-Soviet space in Central Asia, let me say, or in Ukraine, but somewhere else.
The West has launched more than 7,000 airstrikes against the Islamic State in the past year, and Washington has bristled at Moscow's military build-up in Syria. US officials say Russia's surface-to-air missiles, fighter jets and radar jamming equipment are meant to interfere with Western forces. It's hopes that Moscow might cooperate in the military campaign against the Islamic State grow remote. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha Television.
Well, joining me for a chat today to talk about this is Professor A.K. Pasha, Director Gulf Studies Program at JNU. Professor, welcome. Thank you for joining me on World Panorama. A proxy war is being fought yet again between America and Russia, and this time around the playground is Syria.
Well, not exactly America and Russia. It is more of a nature. The confrontation is in the nature of much more wider confrontation, which might take place if this is not resolved sooner than later. Because Russia had been asking the West, NATO particularly, to coordinate its efforts to control or defeat the Islamic State. From the very beginning, for the last 3 years, the Russians had been talking to the EU, to NATO, to America. They had 3-4 rounds with John Kerry, and they have interacted with all the actors in the region, from the Israeli Prime Minister to the Palestinians, Jordanians, Syrians, Iraqi, Iranian, including the Egyptian president, so on and so forth. But they realized that they had fundamental differences between what they wanted and the NATO and the West. And there was no coordination possible. So that's how they waited for 3.5 years long. And then after the conclusion of the nuclear deal with Iran and that P5+1,
yes,
they thought it advisable to take the extreme step of sending their air force and military action. But the timing is important, because the NATO was very close on declaring the northern Syrian territories as no-fly zone, as they had done in Libya. And Turkey had been pushing forward this for a very long time. And that meant that the Syrian Air Force would not be allowed to cross that, and they would use that as a launching pad to attack much more forcibly the Syrian forces. But they are also scared of the Syrian air defense, which the Russians have supplied, and they are capable of taking a heavy toll. But the other point one has to underline here is the Russians also realized that the Western alliance was not sincere, or the coalition was not serious about tackling the Islamic State, because I mean, the Iranians were using it as a propaganda, but the ground reality was that much of the Islamic force military hardware was not actually touched.
indeed.
In Raqqa, in many of the towns, Mosul, Ramadi, Fallujah, and other towns which the IS has captured. And one got the impression that whether they were actually seeing Islamic State as an enemy, or they are using that as a cover, because there were more than 60 states,
Sure.
including Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and others, who are actually supporting some of the groups. So they realized that the Western bogey of Islamic State was actually to dethrone or bring about regime change of Bashar al-Assad and less to do with Islamic States.
Indeed.
Whereas the Russians wanted
Bashar al-Assad to stay.
Bashar al-Assad to stay and talk about political transition and use his forces to weaken the Islamic State.
Yes.
So this contradiction could not be reconciled for more than 3.5 years, and that's how they took this big plunge of sending, and that surprised the NATO and the Americans. And
how do you see this playing out in the future? Do you see them coming together again maybe in the near future, and then all of them together going against the Islamic State, or do you see that not happening at all?
No, there is a possibility, because the Russian and the Western and the other coalition members, they are all opposed to the Islamic State. There's no doubt about it. There are no two opinions, including Iran and Saudi Arabia, so on and so forth. But which one should come first? Whether the Islamic State or Assad? The Russians are, I think, preparing for a regime change or transition after Islamic State is tackled at Geneva 3. So the differences lie in the approach towards the political solution, or the Geneva 3 as they have been calling, because the Russians don't want to send the ground troops on the level which needs to be tackled as far as Islamic State is concerned. Only they feel the Assad forces are capable of tackling this Islamic State. So first they want to enable the Syrian army to regain the territories they have lost over the last 6 months, particularly in the strategic western Syrian coastal areas, which is also the heartland of Bashar al-Assad, and also it houses the Soviet naval base at Tartus and the operations carried on from Latakia. So all that entire range from Aleppo, Homs, Hama, linking the Lebanese border with Damascus is crucial. Once that is consolidated, and I think the Islamic State would be the target by the Russian forces.
All right, Professor, we'll have to leave it at that. Thank you so much for joining us on the program and putting things into perspective for us and sharing your expertise on this very subject.
Thank you.
Well, on that note, of course, we'll slip into a short break here. Still to come, EU ministers agree to speed up deportations of economic migrants in a bid to reduce numbers, taking a harder line against the huge influx of refugees. That and much more coming up. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching Rajya Sabha Television. Well, heavy fighting between the Taliban and Afghan forces in Afghanistan turned even more precarious for residents caught in the gunfire as a leading medical aid group that was bombed withdrew its services. US coalition forces supporting the Afghan government allegedly bombed a hospital run by aid organization Médecins Sans Frontières in Kunduz last week, causing several deaths and raising condemnation from several quarters. Here's more.
An eerie calm after the storm. This hospital in violence-racked Kunduz, run by medical aid group Médecins Sans Frontières, the only one in the region that can deal with major injuries, was bombed in the wee hours last Saturday. Of 200 doctors and patients inside, 22 were killed. 12 of them were MSF staffers, while many others were injured. The bombers were US-led coalition forces fighting the Taliban. The fact remains, they attacked a humanitarian center. Médecins Sans Frontières has lashed out, deciding to end all humanitarian medical operations in Kunduz in protest.
The location of this hospital was well known, was well communicated to all parties, like we do in a conflict. The opposition forces, including in the coalition forces and the Afghan forces. We've given the coordinates. This hospital exists for 4 years. It's a relatively big hospital that is clearly visible and known to everybody. So a precise attack on this big hospital, if not proven differently, leads us to a war crime.
This is an extremely worrying situation now in northeastern Afghanistan. Before this bombing, we were pushing for more access for medicine, for healthcare workers to access this part of the region. Now we find that in fact healthcare staff are pulling out, and with good reason, because they seem to be attacked. So it's very, very worrying.
The bombing brought about the single largest loss of life MSF has suffered in 35 years of working in Afghanistan. The incident draws attention to the perilous circumstances in which MSF frequently operates. The United Nations has voiced strong condemnation too, stressing on the war crime aspect.
The Secretary General recalls that hospitals and medical personnel are explicitly protected under international humanitarian law, and he calls for a thorough and impartial investigation into the attack in order to ensure accountability. MSF has been operating the only hospital in Kunduz under extremely difficult conditions.
The red-faced US forces put forward a collateral damage apology, assuring a thorough probe.
I have ordered a thorough investigation into this tragic incident, and the investigation is ongoing. The Afghans had ordered the same. If errors were committed, we will acknowledge them. We'll hold those responsible accountable, and we will take steps to ensure mistakes are not repeated.
This was the only free trauma care hospital in North Afghanistan, having treated nearly 22,000 patients in 2014. Its closing will leave not only Kunduz residents, but also many Afghans from neighboring districts and provinces with scant medical care. A huge setback, a huge loss for remains of the human touch in war-ravaged Afghanistan. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
Well, let's now take a look at some other news-making events that made headlines across the world this week in Globe Watch.
The European Union has decided on strong measures to keep out would-be economic migrants, looking to send out a stern message urging them not to come. At a meeting in Luxembourg, EU interior ministers agreed to step up deportations and beef up the EU's border agency Frontex. Conclusions from their talks said EU states should detain migrants who may abscond before they are deported. Separately, the EU allocated an additional $450 million to deal with the migrant crisis. Most of the money is to be spent on aid to the millions of Syrian refugees in countries such as Lebanon and Turkey. Former UN General Assembly President John Ashe and 5 others have been charged with massive bribery, part of a wider probe into corruption in the top ranks of the international body. Authorities say Ashe, a former ambassador to the UN for the Caribbean nation of Antigua and Barbuda, who led the UN's 68th General Assembly in 2013, accepted more than $1.3 million in bribes from Chinese businessmen in exchange for advancing their interests in the UN. The complaint says Ashe is charged with 2 counts of tax fraud in connection with the alleged scheme, which extended from 2011 through 2014. He is also accused of taking millions of dollars in salaries funneled through non-governmental organizations connected to Chinese business people. Islamic State militants destroyed the iconic Arch of Triumph in Palmyra, the latest cultural treasure of the ancient site that they have reduced to rubble. The 1,800-year-old monumental arch, which framed the approach to the Roman city, was blown up on Sunday. IS militants seized control of Palmyra, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, in May. Since then, they have beheaded an antiquities expert, leveled 2 temples of immense cultural significance, the Temple of Bel and the Temple of Balshamin. The assaults prompted outrage and condemnation from around the world.
Going on now, a Tunisian coalition of civil society organizations won this year's Nobel Peace Prize for their contribution to building democracy in that country. The Peace Prize was among the other genres for which the award is given. Medicine, Literature and Science announced in Sweden this week. Here are the details.
The Norwegian Nobel Committee has decided that the Nobel Peace Prize for 2015 is to be awarded to the Tunisian National Dialogue Quartet.
The Tunisian National Dialogue Quartet it is, the Nobel Peace Laureate for 2015, chosen from a whopping 273 nominations for what is the world's most prestigious and keenly watched peace award. TNDQ was chosen over nominees Pope Francis, German Chancellor Angela Merkel, Iran nuclear deal negotiators and others. The 2011 Arab Spring that began in Tunisia brought down the government of longtime dictator Zine Abidine Ben Ali, but the country fell into crisis in the years that followed. The Nobel Committee said the quartet had made a decisive contribution to the building of a pluralistic democracy in Tunisia at a time of political assassinations and widespread social unrest. Others point out the wider significance of the recognition.
رسالة أو رسائل إيجابية إلى الدول والبلدان اللي شهدت ثورات واللي ما زالت فيها معناها النزاعات قائمة والمخاطر موجودة، ونحب نتوجه بالنداء وربما من خلال هذا اليوم إلى كل قوى المجتمع المدني في تلك البلدان يأمنوا بقدرتهم، يأمنوا برسالتهم، ويقوموا بمبادرات من أجل تجميع الفرقاء لإيجاد حلول سياسية التي تقي بلدانهم.
Also announced this week the Nobel Prize for Medicine to anti-malaria drug artemisinin, which was developed by Chinese scientists led by Tu Youyou. The drug has worked effectively in Zimbabwe and won praise from locals. A Zimbabwean survey says artemisinin's cure rate against malaria is as high as 97%.
以前那个青蒿素没引进到他国家之前，他们用的是昆仑。现在就是说，听他们统计，就是说自从用了青蒿素以后，就是说治疗对疟疾的治疗的效果特别好，而且副作用也很少，所以就是普遍得到当地的医生和当地的病人的认同。
The Literature Nobel for 2015 goes to Belarusian writer Svetlana Alexievich, whose oral histories have recorded thousands of individual voices to map the implosion of the Soviet Union. Alexievich becomes only the 14th woman to win the prize since its institution. The Nobel Prize for Chemistry this year went to Swedish scientist Thomas Lindahl, American Paul Moldrich, and Turkish-American scientist Aziz Sankar for their discovery of how cells repair damaged DNA. The finding is crucial for understanding cancer and developing drugs against it. Takaki Kajita from Japan and Canada's Arthur B. MacDonald won the 2015 Nobel Prize in Physics for discovering that neutrinos have mass, which changes our views of the universe. The finding lends huge relevance to research on forces that power the sun and run the universe on a large scale. The biggest recognitions on the planet of contributions taking humanity to the next level. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha Television.
Well, let's shift focus now and bring you up to speed with some big events from sporting arenas around the world this week in our segment Sports Action. FIFA has provisionally suspended its President Sepp Blatter, Secretary General Jerome Walker and Vice President Michel Platini for 90 days. The punishments were handed out by the Ethics Committee of Football's world governing body, which is investigating the three over corruption allegations. It also banned ex-FIFA Vice President Chung Mong-jun for 6 years. Issa Hayatou, who heads Africa's Football Confederation, will act as FIFA president during Blatter's ban. Jurgen Klopp has been appointed Liverpool's new manager on a 3-year deal worth £15 million. The 48-year-old German replaces Brendan Rodgers, who was sacked on Sunday after 3.5 years in charge of the club. Klopp has been out of work since May when he ended a 7-year spell at Borussia Dortmund to take a sabbatical. He will earn £5 million a year, rising to £7 million a year with bonuses for a Premier League title or Champions League qualification. The Indian men's football team slumped to their 4th straight defeat, losing 1-2 to Turkmenistan in the 2018 FIFA World Cup qualifiers on Thursday. India thus remain at the bottom of Group D and now have virtually no chance to even qualify for the Asian Cup by finishing third. For the winners, Gubanch Abilov scored the first goal in the 8th minute, while Arslan Mainat Amanov scored the winner at the stroke of the hour. For India, JJ Lalpekhua scored the lone goal in the 28th minute. Formula One could have new owners by the end of the year, with 3 parties currently interested in purchasing the motor racing series. The sports commercial supremo Bernie Ecclestone made the announcement on Tuesday. Ecclestone did not name any of the interested parties. CVC Capital Partners are currently the controlling shareholders with a 35.5% stake, while Ecclestone holds 5.3%. US investment groups BlackRock and Waddell & Reed, along with Norway's Norges Bank, are among other shareholders. Former Pakistan captain Shoaib Malik was included as the 16th member of the Test squad for the 3-match series against England in the UAE. The team management had requested Malik's inclusion based on his current batting form in limited overs and as an extra bowling option. Malik played his last Test against England at Birmingham in 2010. And finally, some good news on the wildlife front. A new World Wildlife Fund report released this week describes discoveries of more than 200 new species in the Himalayas in the last 5 years, including plants, invertebrates, reptiles, fish and more. I'm going to leave you with these visuals. Have a good week.